This podcast is intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to Legend of the Bones. Following in the footsteps of giants, Legend of the Bones is a chimera. A mix of old-school tabletop RPG and dark fantasy storytelling. As its name might suggest, in Legend of the Bones the dice rule. There'll be no rerolls, no fudging the dice, no metacurrency. The roll of the bones will determine the character's destiny, and no one will be spared their fate. None shall escape the destiny of bone. Last time on Legend of the Bones. On their journey upriver to Varfell, the companions came upon the burning village of Lost Withel, which had seemingly been attacked and put to the torch by outlaws. Along with the crew of the Uverdlacher, the companions desperately tried to combat the fires, but to no avail, until Lena prayed to Torvin, the god of the sky and storms, to send a deluge of rain to douse the flames. Sometime after, the companions searched through the burnt buildings, and in the remnants of the village hall found a dozen skeletal remains and evidence of a celebration. Soon, the survivors who had fled into the forest returned, and one of them, a man called Ehbron, told how a band of outlaws had recently moved into the area. He explained that the outlaw leader, Roscallan, had made advances towards Ehbron's sister, Morwenna. Morwenna had rejected Roscallan, not least because she was betrothed to another, and in revenge, the outlaws attacked the village during Morwenna's wedding, abducting her in the process. With no time to waste, and with Ehbron's help, the companions tracked Roscallan's band to an abandoned hunting lodge deep in the forest as night fell. Here, whilst reconnoitering the scene, one of the apparent outlaws appeared, and stepping outside began to empty his bladder. Just as the companions were considering how to capture the man alive, they spotted Ehbron, who had slipped away from the group and was now creeping towards the man. Chapter 50, Part 1, Day 51, Night. Party status: Beric, 43 out of 43 hit points. Lena, 31 out of 31 hit points. Valen, 19 out of 19 hit points. Talion, 24 out of 24 hit points. Canute, 31 out of 31 hit points. Arn, 24 out of 24 hit points. Kettle, 12 out of 12 hit points. Ehbron, 21 out of 21 hit points. Spells available: Valen has memorized Push, Shield, Revive, Clairvoyance, and Ignite. Talion has memorized Resolve, Poetic Prose, Pitch, and Imbue. Lena can pray for 2 second-level miracles and 1 third-level miracle. The soft glow of the waxing gibbous moon bathed the forest in a silvery light, casting an ethereal sheen over the landscape. Shadows danced among the trees, their branches swaying gently in the cool night breeze, while the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the sweet lingering aroma of honeysuckle and meadowsweet. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its call echoing through the stillness, while the gentle burbling of the nearby stream gave voice to the water's endless journey. The forest seemed alive with the quiet symphony of night sounds. Across the clearing, close to the ruined hunting lodge, the outlaw finished urinating and began fastening his breeches. The dilapidated structure loomed behind him, its broken timbers jutting up and out like spears in a shield wall. The companions, crouched in the undergrowth, observed anxiously from their vantage point, their breaths held as the woodsman, Ehbron, silently stalked his prey from the shadows. There was no time for the companions to get to him, and calling out would have given them away. They could do nothing but watch. Beric silently hoped that the man from Lost Withel had the wherewithal to take the outlaw alive. "Be not a fool," Beric muttered under his breath, his voice barely a whisper. At that moment, one of the horses whinnied again. Whether it was because they had picked up Ehbron's scent, or because they were soliciting a treat from their human, who knew? But the outlaw's attention turned to the beast. "Quiet down," he commanded irritably, and turned to walk back into the broken down building. Seeing his chance, Ehbron moved quickly from the shadows, hoping to grab the man from behind. But in his haste, a stick snapped under his foot, the sharp sound cutting through the night like a knife. The outlaw froze mid-step, his head whipping around, eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows for the source of the noise. Ehbron, realizing his mistake, pressed himself against the trunk of a nearby tree, hoping the darkness would conceal him. The companions held their breath, hearts pounding in their chests. Beric clenched his fists, silently willing Ehbron to remain hidden. The outlaw took a cautious step forward, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword, suspicion written on his face. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice a low growl. Beric picked up a stone, glancing at Canute, who was crouching next to him. "Get ready," he whispered, to which the Skade nodded, and slowly slid his blade from its scabbard. Judging where the horses might be, Beric took the stone and hurled it towards the building. In an instant, one of the animals neighed in alarm, causing the outlaw to turn towards the commotion. "Now!" Beric hissed, and with a swift movement, both he and Canute broke from their cover, hoping to close the distance between them and the outlaw before the man could react. The outlaw, sensing the movement, spun around, drawing his sword in a flash of steel. Pursuit. That first dive roll you heard earlier was Ehbron failing his wilderness stealth check. The second was a roll to see whether Beric could hit one of the horses, and amazingly, even with being heavily penalised, he succeeded. Okay, so one man is not going to be much of a threat to the companions, and I think that given the circumstances, there is no way that he would stand and fight. I'm not even going to roll for this. Logic tells me that the outlaw will attempt to flee and raise the alarm. Now, unbeknownst to the companions, the outlaws are hiding out in the cellars situated under the ruins of the hunting lodge, which are accessed via a trapdoor inside the building. I don't think that my normal pursuit rules will work well in this situation, as they are designed for a longer chase, so I'm going to fall back on the BX rules for initiative and movement. Here, the rules state that if running, a character can move their base movement rate in a single round, so for the heavily armoured warriors, this would be 90 feet, more than enough to reach the outlaw. However, this does depend on whether the outlaw is surprised, and if not, then who wins the initiative. As this could end rather quickly, let's establish those two things before we go any further. Rolling a d6 to determine if the outlaw is surprised. A result of 1 or 2 means he will be. A 6. Okay, his heightened state of alert meant that he was anticipating something. Time to roll initiative. The outlaw. A 3. The party. A 4. Beric and Canute get the jump on the man, charging across the clearing before he can react. Right, so first things first. I have decided that the outlaws will be a mix of fighters and rogues. I am going to make a high-low roll on a d20 to determine which class this man is. A low roll will be a rogue. A 12. Okay, so he is a fighter. I'm going to roll up some stats off mic. Back in a minute. Okay, I'm back. This adversary is a second level fighter with 12 hit points. He has a strength of 13, which affords a +1 bonus to hit and damage. and wears leather armour providing an ascending armour class of 12. Now, as the companions want to take this man alive, Beric will barge into the outlaw and attempt to tackle him to the ground. The basic expert rules do not cover this kind of scenario, so I'm going to house rule it. Firstly, Beric will need to make a successful attack roll. This represents his ability to make contact or the outlaw dodging out of the way. However, given that Beric is charging at full speed, I'm going to apply a -2 penalty. Netting that against some of his bonuses, Beric will need to roll a 10 or more. A 17. So far, so good. Next, both Beric and the outlaw need to make an opposed strength test. I've seen a couple of ways to resolve opposed tests, but the one that I will use is that both parties must try to roll under the relevant attribute, and the one that does so by the greatest margin wins. If both parties fail, then failure by the least margin wins. Now, given that Beric also has the full momentum of a charge, I will award a +2 bonus, meaning that he needs to roll as far under 19 as possible. A 2! His opponent cannot beat this. Beric barrels into the outlaw, knocking the wind out of him and sweeping him off his feet as he brings the man to the ground with a thud. Canute is there an instant later, and before the outlaw can recover, the Skarne extends his sword so the tip is at the man's throat. The man squirms and begins to let out a yelp, but is quickly silenced when Canute gently presses the blade forward, causing a trickle of blood to appear. Canute brings the index finger of his left hand up to his lips. Shh. Having captured the outlaw, the companions have an opportunity to gain important insight about the rest of the gang. But whether they can get their captive to talk may be another matter. Now, Canute would have little compunction about using torture to extract the information from their captive, but there is no way that Lena would allow that to happen, despite the man being beyond the protection of the law. On that basis, intimidation and threat will be the Skarne's tool of choice. I'm going to make an opposed check between Canute's charisma and the outlaw's morale. Canute's charisma is 15. Here is the roll. A 19! That's 4 degrees of failure. Now to roll against the outlaw's morale of 8. An 8! 0 degrees of success. Clearly the outlaw fears Roscallon more than whatever Canute might do to him. With that in mind, back in episode 48, I asked the Oracle if these outlaws were in the employ of someone powerful. That result was a yes but. This suggested to me that there was probably a proxy involved. Now, way back in episode 18, we learnt that another outlaw by the name of L4 Kano was operating in the region, and on the behest of Lord Polmir's steward, Maelor, had been responsible for the attack on 4 Rivers. My question then is whether Roscallon is part of Kano's wider gang, once again working for Maelor, whom we have already established is one of Reynard of Harburg's trusted lieutenants. Let's ask the Oracle. A 5. That's a straight yes. Okay, with nothing else for the companions to elicit, let's get back to the story. Chapter 50, Part 2, Day 51, Night. Party status. The party status is unchanged. The rope bit deeply into the man's wrists, each desperate struggle only serving to chafe the skin raw until blood flowed freely from the opened wounds. His eyes, wide with alarm and glistening with pain, darted frantically around the clearing. He tried to cry out a warning, but the rag stuffed into his mouth muffled his attempts, turning his cries into pitiful, unintelligible sounds. The outlaw had proven unbreakable, steadfastly refusing to divulge any information that could be used against his comrades. Neither threats of pain nor promises of freedom had swayed him. Perhaps he knew his fate, or maybe it was some bizarre code of honor that kept his lips sealed. Regardless, having failed to extract anything useful, Canute had ordered the man stripped to his underclothes and bound to a nearby tree.
We shall take him back to Lostwithal,
Canute declared, his voice cold and unyielding.
The folk there can dispense their own justice.
But surely they will kill him, Lena argued, her voice tinged with a mix of concern and frustration. She glanced over at Ehbron, who was staring venomously at their captive.
Aye, more likely than not.
Canute agreed without a trace of sentiment.
But forget not what he has done. He has chosen to live outside the protection of the law, and now he must face the consequences.
Lena opened her mouth to retort, but found no words to counter Canute's logic. The thought of handing the man over to his death discomfited her, but there was no denying his part in the wickedness. Having won the argument, Canute turned his attention to Kettle.
Stay here and guard him.
The Skarne warlord commanded.
If he tries to escape, kill him.
Kettle looked disappointed. He was young and eager to prove himself to his lord. He started to object, but spotting Arn shaking his head, thought better of it. Yes, lord, he replied, albeit reluctantly. We must linger not, Beric stated, bringing the group's attention back to the matter at hand. This fellow will soon be missed. Come on. Gathering their things, the big warrior led the way, as the remaining companions crept into the dilapidated structure of the hunting lodge. Up close, it was evident that the place had been abandoned for many years. Only a portion of the wood-shake roof remained, and the interior walls were practically non-existent. Ivy and brambles had overtaken in many areas, and what timber remained was broken and rotten. In what would have been the main living quarters, the companions found it had been turned into a makeshift stable for 6 horses, which stood tethered in the darkness. Beric approached the nearest beast and stroked his muzzle, and it responded by nuzzling against his chest. The animals looked on docilely as the companions began to search for some clue as to the whereabouts of the other outlaws. It did not take long before Arn signalled the companions to one of the corners, and gathering round, they saw that set into the floorboards was a trapdoor. Off mic, I rolled to see how quickly the party would discover the trapdoor within the ruins of the hunting lodge, and with them splitting up and searching together, it only took one turn to do so. Having located the trapdoor, it would not take much for the companions to deduce that the outlaw's lair lay beyond. But would they consider that there may be an alternative entrance, or indeed an escape route? With no rogue in the party, the only character I think might consider this is Canute. To see whether this crosses his mind, I am going to make a wisdom check for the Northman. Canute will need to roll under his wisdom of 10 to succeed. A 15, so no. Okay, the party will enter via the trapdoor. Before they do so, I'm going to make a listen at door check. All the characters have a base 1 in 6 chance, so I'll simply roll for Beric. A 1! Well, I was not expecting the warrior to succeed. Right, let's see what happens. Beric laid his body prone, pressing his ear against the rough, splintered wood of the trapdoor. Above him, the wind rustled softly through the leaves of the ancient trees surrounding the clearing, their whispers mingling with the burbling of the nearby stream. The big man had to concentrate to block out the noise, his brow furrowed in intense focus. Below, there was a rattle and a dull thud, like that of a heavy door being opened and closed, followed by the muffled sound of voices echoing through the underground chamber. 2 men, by Beric's reckoning, though the words were too indistinct to make out. The air was thick, with the scent of damp earth and rotten wood. A moment later, the voices fell silent, and the door opened and closed once again, with a creak and a thump. Beric got to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid making any noise.
2 men, but what is left? So there must be several rooms down there.
He relayed in a low, gravelly voice, barely above a whisper.
On,
he said, turning to the Skarne warrior, whose eyes glinted with the reflection of the moonlight.
On my mark, open the trapdoor.
Talion. He turned to the bard, who was already knocking an arrow to his bowstring.
Ready your bow. When Arn opens it, take a shot at whoever is down there. I'll go in after and finish them.
The 2 men indicated their understanding, their faces set with resolve as they moved into position, each man acutely aware of the stakes. Canute gripped Beric's bicep as the warrior readied himself.
Be careful, cousin,
he whispered, to which the big man responded with a nod and a grim smile. Arn knelt behind the hinges of the trapdoor, his fingers wrapped tightly around the iron ring set into the wood, ready to pull. Beric's heart pounded in his chest. His plan was far from ideal, but in the circumstances, they had no other choice. Taking a breath, he raised his hand, then gave the signal. With a swift motion, Arn pulled hard, and the trapdoor creaked open. Soft light immediately bled from the opening, but in contrast to the darkness of the night, still momentarily stung the companion's eyes. The scent of damp earth and rust grew stronger, mingling with the unmistakable odour of burning torches. A set of narrow steps led down 10 feet into a small antechamber, perhaps 15 feet square. It was empty save for a small table, upon which were cups, coins, and a pair of bone dice. Sat at the table, a man was cleaning his nails with the tip of his dagger.
You took your time,
he said, before glancing upwards, just as Talion loosed his arrow.
Entering combat.
Once again, a single outlaw is not going to cause the party much trouble, but their companions must neutralise the enemy fast, or they will raise the hue and cry. First, I need to determine whether this outlaw is surprised. Now, given they were expecting their comrade to return, they will likely be off guard, so I'm going to increase the chance of surprise to 3 and 6. Here is the roll. A 1. Okay, so the companions get a free attack. Now I'm going to make a high-low roll to determine whether this outlaw is a fighter or a rogue. A 14, they're a fighter. Talion takes his shot. The outlaw is wearing leather armour, conferring an armour class of 12, but with his dexterity bonus, and the bonus for short range, Talion will need to roll just an 8 or more. A 9 for... just 1 point of damage. The bard's arrow whistles past the man's head, scratching his cheek. Immediately after, Beric runs down the stairs. Given the awkwardness of the space, I'm going to make a dexterity check for the warrior. If he succeeds, I will allow him to make an attack in the same round. Otherwise, he will need the full round to negotiate the stairs. Beric will need to roll a 12 or less. An 8. Despite his size, the big man deftly bounds down the wooden steps and closes in for an attack. He will need to roll an 8 or more to hit. A 14 for a total of 11 points of damage. Taking the outlaw by surprise, Beric hacks down with Callous Feather. The enchanted blade bites into the man's left shoulder near the neck. There is a fountain of blood as the jugular vein is severed, and the sword rips open the man's chest before he falls lifelessly to the floor. With 2 of the 9 known outlaws taken care of, I need to establish whether this is the full extent of their strength. I'm going to turn to the Oracle for this. Are there any more outlaws beyond those known by Ehbron? A 3. That's a no but. That but makes me think that there is something else in the cellars, or there is something unusual about these brigands. Oh, hang on. I have an idea. But more of that later. In the immediate situation, I will make a listener door check for Beric for the room's only exit. A 6. The big man hears no sound. Now, unbeknownst to the companions, beyond this door, the outlaws have set up a trap. Again, with no rogue in the party, I will make a wisdom check for Beric, to see whether he thinks to search for such a danger. Beric will need to roll equal or less than 9 to succeed. A 14. I guess the warrior is unused to such underhand methods. I'm going to check for each person within the marching order to see whether they set off the trap. A roll of 1 or 2 on a d6 will indicate that the trap has been sprung. First up, Beric. A 4. Canute. A 2. Okay, I'm going to make a couple of rolls off mic for the result of Canute triggering the trap, and we'll see what happens in the narrative. Chapter 50, Part 3, Day 51, Night. Party status. The party status is unchanged. The air in the small underground chamber was dank and moist. The walls were made of roughly hewn stone, between whose gaps grew soft green moss. Underfoot, the floor was nothing more than compacted earth, uneven and treacherous, while set into the south wall was a heavy iron-bound door, perhaps originally designed to preserve the temperature and humidity beyond, to aid the preservation of whatever had been stored in the cellars. Beric knelt beside the lifeless body of the outlaw, his fingers searching through the blood-soaked jerkin. The outlaw's face was twisted in a final grimace of shock and pain, and there was almost something animalistic about the man's expression. Canute, meanwhile, was examining the man's sword, which had been leant against the wall. The Northman had a curious expression on his face, and seemed interested in the blade. Perhaps he saw some value in it, for after a minute he returned it to its scabbard and fastened the belt around his waist. Finding nothing of consequence, Beric pocketed the handful of silver coins from the nearby table, then pressed his ear to the door, listening intently. Reassured by the silence on the other side, with a firm grip on the latch loop, he pulled the door open, revealing a short, dimly lit corridor, terminating in another doorway shrouded in shadow. The walls were lined with the same rough stone, though the air here was noticeably less humid. Talion produced the enchanted moonstone to light their way, handing it to Valen so that his hands were free to use his bow, and after, Beric led the way into the corridor. The warrior's movements were deliberate and cautious, his senses heightened, wary that whomever recently departed the previous chamber might return. In the dim light, he did not see the thin wire stretched across the corridor, and by pure chance his foot narrowly missed it. A moment later, Lena's voice rang out in alarm.
Look out!
The warning came just as the crunch of a blade hitting mail echoed through the corridor. Canute cried out, stumbling forward and knocking into Beric, almost toppling the big man. Beric pivoted quickly to support his cousin, who had been winded by the impact of a huge axe that had swung down from the ceiling, striking him in the back. The deadly pendulum now swayed gently in the middle of the corridor, and Beric realised that Canute was lucky to be alive.
Easy,
he said, steadying the Northman as he regained his footing. Canute's face was contorted with pain, but he managed to stay upright. Lena was quick to attend the warrior. She examined the links of Canute's mail, which had somehow withstood the impact. There was no visible blood, but she knew the force of the blow would leave him bruised for many days.
There's no sign of bleeding,
she reported, though her voice carried a note of concern. Having already called upon the Nine several times to aid the villagers of Lostwithel, she would be unable to ask their favour again to alleviate the wound. Canute straightened himself with a grimace, then stoically nodded to indicate that they should move forward. As they advanced, Beric's eyes scanned the corridor for any further traps. The air grew colder, and the silence was oppressive. Reaching the doorway, the warrior paused, his hand hovering over the latch. He turned to the companions, his voice a low whisper.
Stay sharp.
Taking a breath, Beric pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and dimly lit, the air thick with the pungent smell of animal musk and decay. In the west wall was another door, and the earthen floor was strewn with straw and bones. It was clear that this chamber had been used as a kennel. In the centre of the room, a massive direwolf lay chained to the wall. Its fur was matted and dirty, its eyes glowing with a feral intensity. As the door creaked open, the beast's head snapped up, and it let out a low, menacing growl. Beric's heart pounded in his chest as the direwolf lunged forward, straining against his chains. The metal links rattled ominously, and the beast's jaws snapped inches from Beric's face, speckling him with saliva. He stumbled away.
Get back!
He shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls, and the companions began to retreat back down the corridor. The direwolf's growls grew louder, its gleaming yellow eyes locked onto Beric with predatory focus. The chains holding it were old and rusty, and with a final powerful lunge, the beast broke free. It charged, snarling at the prey before it, baying for blood. Thank you for listening to Legend of the Bones. I hope you've enjoyed the show. If you like what you've heard, then please consider rating and reviewing the show in your podcatcher of choice. Not only do I love seeing the feedback, but it really does help the show to reach new listeners. As always, where would I be without my amazing cast of voice talent? Just one person to thank in this episode. Returning once again in the role of Canute is Jon Cohen, the creator of Tale of the Manticore. Thanks, Jon, you always deliver. If you've not yet listened to Tale of the Manticore, then you are missing out on something truly special, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. You can also help by liking or reposting new episode announcements, or by recommending the show online or to a friend. You really can't beat the power of word of mouth. Alternatively, if you'd like to show your appreciation by buying me a metaphorical cup of tea, then I have a Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/Legend of the Bones. Any donations will go towards the show's running costs. If you're interested, I also have a range of merchandise, which can be found at www.redbubble.com/people/legendbones/shop. To keep the cost down to you, all items are presented at zero markup. I make no money from them. It's purely to give something back to fans of the show. I would also love to know what you think of the show, and I do respond to every message I receive. So with that in mind, you can contact me on X at LegendBones, Blue Sky at LegendBones, Mastodon at LegendBones at ttrpg-hangout.social, Instagram at LegendOfTheBones, email at legendofthebones@gmail.com, or go to legendofthebones.blogspot.com for show notes, house rules, character profiles, art, maps and more. Join me next time to find out what awaits our adventurers as the bones decide their fate. None shall escape the destiny of Bone.
It has been 13 years since the world nearly split in two. Those of us that knew of the cataclysm at the time have tried to move on. However, as the lines between worlds started to thin again, it was only ever a matter of time before something terrible started to pay attention. But who will stand at the gates for us? Why, for our employees at Thorne Investigations, of course.
Least I can do for, all that you do for me.
My reflection looked back, distorted.
There's absolutely nothing normal about this.
This wasn't right from the start, so why don't you tell me the bits you're leaving out?
The Thorne Files is a Monster of the Week actual play podcast, perfect for fans of mind-bending mysteries and terrifying monsters. We have new episodes coming out every other Friday, and you can find us on whatever podcasting app you use. Join us for our new season in January 2025, or if you'd like, go listen to our first season. Whatever the case, we'll be happy to have you. Just be ready to be scared.